Hi, everybody. This is Charles Hoskinson broadcasting live from warm, sunny Colorado. Always warm, always sunny, sometimes Colorado. Today is March 14th, 2022. It's been a little while since I've done an AMA, but I've been really, really busy. A lot of stuff going on right now. Huge amount of project management, program management meetings, a lot of work quantification. We had a lovely series of workshops with the CF, but those shall remain nameless because there's a lot to internally do before we make any announcements there. And ecosystem continues to grow by leaps and bounds. I think over 517 dApps are under construction. If you go to Cardano Nexus, or excuse me, CardanoCube.io, you can see, you could just see the remarkable ecosystem map and how quickly things are growing. What is the status of sidechains to build cross-chain dApps? Are really missing out massive dApp ecosystem. Well, Milkomeda is about, and there's also Mamba project, and we should be able to make a meaningful update on Mamba at the end of the month. The last information I got, which was February, so I haven't checked up on that team in about 2 weeks, is that they were still slated for some form of a testnet here this month. So I will get back to you guys on that. For those of you who don't know, Mamba is a BFT Ethereum sidechain for Cardano. How we started is a testnet disconnected, similar to Catalyst being disconnected, build up an ecosystem there, test the ERC20 converter, get great benchmarks, optimize, get good code quality, and then it's part of a broader sidechains agenda. Now, Cardano sidechains are really interesting, and the reason being is that it actually has a monetary incentive for ADA holders when a sidechain is released on Cardano. So how we're thinking about making it work is that you have Cardano, the main network, and that's powered by Ouroboros. And you have a bunch of stake pool operators that run the system authorized by the delegators. And that's a large set. That's that K factor. So as K increases over time, as ADA gets larger, then you get more and more members of that set. Then because that set exists and it's a secure root of trust, what you can do is sortition the set and use it to bootstrap a fast BFT protocol. And we have that protocol. It's called Ouroboros BFT. It's really cool. It's very simple. It's very lightweight. But then you can run a sidechain. It has the same security dynamics as the base layer, but you have fast finality and you have high throughput with that system. Now, if you have tokens in that system and it's bootstrapped, then those rewards for making those blocks also get paid to the stake pool operator. So let's say you have an ecosystem with 50 sidechains and 50 tokens and the main chain, then the stake pools would actually make 50 tokens plus ADA when they make blocks, assuming that they've been selected to participate in each of those quorums. So the more sidechains, the merrier for these types of things. As for TVL and these other things, I mean, it's early days. We've gone from 2 to over 250 million, and the majority of dApps seem to be backloaded towards the Vasil Hardfork because they want to benefit from pipelining as well as the expressivity increases and expressiveness increases in Plutus. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But again, those growth metrics are looking phenomenal. There's a spool up time when you create these things, and we're getting there. Is Vasil short for Vaseline because it will make everything smoother? No, it's short for Vasil Dobov, who was a really good fan of the Cardano ecosystem, a great human being, and an old friend of mine who perished last year. And so we wanted to honor him by naming one of the hard forks after him. Charles, what do you think about the EU possibly banning proof of work? Will Bitcoin and Ethereum take a hit? I mean, there's been certainly some conversations about it. It's puzzling to me because people in the proof of work world live in this bizarre reality where all the energy spent on Bitcoin doesn't seem to exist. It's as if we have unlimited energy and this is the best possible use case of it. They don't acknowledge that there's a high energy consumption. It's there, you acknowledge it. Now, they seem to conflate the idea that this is, in their view, useful or productive use of energy with the concept that we are at an energy deficit in the world. And what we're doing is we're taking the battery that millions, if not billions of years of vegetation gave us from fossil fuels, and we're rapidly expending that battery to power the entire world. We don't have a sustainable power grid. So we're running an energy deficit for production relative to consumption when you look at renewable to non-renewable sources. And part of that deficit now is the Bitcoin network. And so a lot of policymakers are saying, well, first we need to rebalance these things and make more or equivalent to what we spend. So we have a surplus or neutrality. So some form of renewable energy source. Okay, and energy enters the system all the time. It's called the sun. And at the same time, we also need to conserve large energy expenditures. So people go, for example, to the concrete business, and because it's a huge consumer of electricity, or the metallurgy people, so the steel people, these types of things. They say, you guys consume aluminum, same, huge amounts of electricity, massive amounts of power to do what you do from the whole cycle of the supply chain. We need to find a way to reduce that and make what you do more environmentally friendly. So that's what regulators do to industries. So then you look at the blockchain business and you see Bitcoin and Ethereum and Cardano and Solana and all these other things, and they do some things. And then there's a question of efficiency behind the things that they do. The problem with maximalism is what they do is they say it is incomparable what they do. So even though Cardano and Bitcoin are both UTXO-based systems, both have deflationary monetary policies, both process transactions and move value, both use cryptography, and both are functionally cryptocurrencies, what the Bitcoin people do is say proof of stake simply does not work. Everything on Cardano is an elaborate proof of perpetual motion scam, and it's a plutocracy controlled by central bankers or whatever the latest argument is. In other words, we're not legitimate. We don't exist. We should be ignored. And now, if that argument doesn't stand, then they run into a very inconvenient truth. You have system A that uses more power than Ecuador, and system B that uses the power of a warehouse, and one is better, faster, and cheaper, mine. So that's a problem. Okay? So this is one of those uncomfortable conversations with the European Union while they talk about proof of work. And they say, okay, well, if you have two industries, within an industry, if you have two approaches and one is massively more energy efficient than the other, the one that's not has to justify itself in some way. So what is it? Is it more security? Well, that's debatable because all these papers have been written and these systems are running and they've never been hacked for years with plenty of people trying to do that. Is it in some way more efficiency, or it's more egalitarian, or it's more decentralized, whatever that means, but we have no index for decentralization. So I think it's premature and bad for the EU to ban proof of work, but it does bring in an interesting conversation, which is the European Union, by just asking the question, forces many inconvenient, uncomfortable conversations to come into play. What if a usable proof of work exists? We've written a paper for that. So does that matter? Maybe we have to move from useless to useful. Would it being a distributed computer actually, instead of just a Rube Goldberg machine that wastes electricity, would that make people feel better? So I don't think Bitcoin and Ethereum will take a hit at all. I think that just like China banning Bitcoin really didn't do anything to the ecosystem. But I do think it is a wake-up call for the astute listener to really start talking about comparability within industry. Because if you use analogy, if I have two ways of making concrete, and one way involves burning all the forests down, and the other way is sustainable and uses sunlight, and I can do it forever and not destroy the environment, I mean, which one would you pick? And if the people who say burning all the forests down, it somehow keeps the evil spirits away, whereas the sunlight attracts them, or it's a scam. It's like you have the same piles of concrete on both sides. The burden eventually follows on them. And actually, the Ethereum crowd admits this, which is why they're moving to a proof of stake based system. And it's my belief that over time, the majority of value in the cryptocurrency space will actually be protected by proof of stake style systems as opposed to proof of work style systems. And they say, well, that's equivalent to central banking and it's an oligarchy. No, it's not a plutocracy or oligarchy. Central bank system, I can't go to an exchange and buy part of the Federal Reserve and have a say in the governance of the Federal Reserve. At any given time, for any proof of stake coin with liquidity, I'm always able to acquire some of that power of the system and have a say over its governance. And ASICs are not necessarily a fair game. What if the primary ASIC supply chain is patented and private? you're not allowed by law to replicate what they've done. You'll have to spend millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions to replicate what they've done. And they have first access to it. Is that an egalitarian democratic system? Used to be different. When I first joined Bitcoin back in the day, we could mine on CPUs. So this computer right here, or GPUs. And I even did. I had a Crossfire 45850 AMD cards. I was running 1.2 gigahashes. It's great times. So it was very egalitarian back then. But now, not as much. It's a little harder to get your hands on these things reliably, especially during a chip shortage. It tends to stay in certain areas, certain friends and family. Not to say it won't get better, but it just gives you a sense of the nuances of these things. And by the way, Cardano is not mine. I know people are going to take that quote out of context. It's the communities, obviously, and so forth. But we just live in an age where people do that. And this is just an example of people. So how many more years are you going to drag on with your vaporware project, publishing more and more useless papers before you go to prison? 7-day wait time for your DEX, by the way. Charles, why is Hedera so much better? Did you read their white paper? No, I haven't had a chance to read the white paper yet, but I'm curious to know, why do you feel it's so much better? What's the reason? What compels you to say that? Just tell everybody. Charles, what do you think of the current congestion status on Cardano? Do you believe right now the parameters are adjusted so that it can smoothly run into the next scalability update? Well, there'll be more parameter updates. And the next update, the hard fork that's coming in June will be very significant. A big performance improvement, like within an order of magnitude. And I think that will significantly scale up the network to a point where we can handle a lot of load. It's actually fortuitous that Cardano is running at such large capacity. It's giving us a really good sense of what Cardano can do in practice. So when we built Cardano, there were a lot of simulations that were done and deep conversations about basically the capabilities of Cardano to perform well under high load, adversarial load, asymmetries, asymmetrical attacks, these types of things. And in the lab, we believed that the design was great. And now we're actually seeing those scenarios occur. DDoS attacks, high load, big saturation in the mempool, these types of things. And so far, Cardano is behaving exactly as we expected, which is just great. And as we roll out pipelining and other updates, it's only going to get better. So I think that we'll be fine. In fact, there was a big spike, and now things are smoothing out a little bit, and there'll be more parameter updates to come. And then we'll kind of cruise towards June, and that will really improve the state of affairs. And it's a 1-2 punch, pipelining and then input endorsers. So enormous amount of work is happening at the moment for input endorsers, and that will eventually aggregate to a paper that is published called Ouroboros Leos. And there's a blog post on the way, so we should be able to get that out soon. And that blog post will kind of cover the high-level design and really give people a sense of why it's so special. What's unique about input endorsers is that it moves us to a situation where the bottleneck of the system is no longer the consensus mechanics, but rather the network stack. So it can scale to the demand, and it really becomes like these DAG-style protocols that have super high throughput. So as bandwidth improves over time, the network organically gets faster. So I think those two things together will give us a lot of headroom and then just more optimal use of the extended UTXO market. And there has to be some updates on the economics of the system, which is why we wrote the Babel fees blog post and these other things to kind of give a sense of what needs to be done. Charles, would you ever consider writing a book, and what would it involve? I've thought about writing a few books, so I really do want to write a book on governance, and that's the first kind of in the queue. And then at some point when I retire, I'd like to write memoirs of all the things I've seen and done and go through all of that. I never particularly thought that I, as a person, was so incredibly interesting. You know, I just build stuff and I enjoy people, and that's great. But apparently, there's Charles the persona and there's Charles the person, and it's a very strange thing. Everybody in the blockchain space at the moment seems to have an opinion on me, one way or the other, negative or positive, and they just feel very comfortable sharing that opinion, in some cases beyond the bounds of decency, and publishing things and so forth. And that's fine. But at the end of the day, does that in any meaningful way actually change the things that I've built? It's all out there. You know, the critics of me, they seem to conveniently forget Cardano and IO and like the last 6 years of my life and all the places I've done and been. And it's just bizarre. It's as if it's like 2014 or something like that. Okay. And, it's deeply frustrating at times. It's crazy, to have such a gap between how you perceive yourself to be and how you perceive that you treat others, and then the common notions in certain circles. And, a lot of people have reached out to me and told me, hey, don't let it bother you. The work continues. Just keep moving forward. And there's a lot of truth in that advice. But, every human has built in this need for justice or this need for vindication or this, I have to tell you what the real story is. But the reality is that the attacks and the misrepresentations, they're against a person who doesn't exist. They're a collective construction of the criticism, ideas, and hopes, dreams, whatever, of a group of people. And so go attack that person. And once you realize it's a different person, it really just rolls right off of you. You don't really think too much about it. I only let it bother me when actually it seems to hurt the commercialization of the projects I work on or the people that I work with. And some of them are deeply frustrated, but for the most part, people seem to be able to keep the work and keep going. And, nothing has ever happened that, in my view, has escalated to that point. Now, in terms of writing a book, it has to be valuable to the reader. It's not useful to just focus on feelings and thoughts and salacious gossip and these things. There has to be some wisdom that's been validated in the thread. There has to be something productive for it to stand the test of time. When I began this podcast earlier, I talked about this idea of wisdom being how one should use their time and all these things. I've been interested in focus and time management, about the efficiency of one's use of time. Those kinds of things, those tools for life and examples of their applications and where they provide value. I think those are important. I'm starting to become increasingly connected to the arc of history. I'm not connected to a point where I can influence it, but I am in the room or in events that actually have meaningful significance, like I've been around in the Ethiopian Civil War and all these things, but we're small players in that respect. And I often think, well, what if we weren't? What if the things we do, the things we build at some juncture or point actually start influencing and changing the arc of history? At that point, then I think that's meaningful to discuss, because there's social value in the thought process that led to the decisions that we made. So I started keeping a journal and really trying to keep it up to date and invest time in it, just in case I have to go back, because innocent decisions or, observations or these things at the time could turn out to be the critical factor in something very significant. And before the critics dogpile on, say, oh, this is narcissism or something like that, well, let's say that we end up building the national ID system for a country, and that ends up being the basis for e-voting, and that ends up being the basis for all e-voting in the entire world. I mean, there's not outside the realm of possibility. Cardano was just an idea in 2015, and now it's a network with millions of people worth tens of billions of dollars that's growing at a very rapid pace. If that continues, it could be worth $1 trillion and have 1 billion people in 20 years or 30 years. That could happen. Who knows? In which case, the influence that would have, the industries it would control, it could be the back end of nation states. So historians will ask, business leaders will ask, how did we get here? What was the point of that? So it is important just to write things down, just in case that does occur, in which case you can go back with some degree of objectivity, or at least the subjectivity of the moment, as opposed to the hindsight of the future. Charles, I would like to hear your thoughts on the future of smartphone software. Will we see non-proprietary OSs becoming popular? It would be good if we had a Linux of smartphone. Well, Adam, technically, Android is a Linux project. It is technically open source, which is why many people use it. But I hear you. I feel you. It doesn't feel that way when ultimately there are gatekeepers who control the experience and what can be on it. And this is the perpetual frustration of open source. And this is the perpetual frustration of centralization. If 99% of your ecosystem is open source, but 1% isn't, or it's somehow curated and controlled, and that 1% happens to be the skeleton key or the gatekeeper for how people use the other 99%, you're not actually open source. This is why I hate projects that claim to be cryptocurrencies, but then patent things. Because one guy, one group of people ultimately has a legal monopoly on who gets to use it, and they act as a curator. Even if they don't choose to use that, they have the right to do so. And that really hurts Fortune 500 and government adoption. Actually, cross-comparison of cryptographic algorithms, you look at NTRU, and this lattice-based crypto compared to their open source equivalents, people always seem to pick the open source patent-free versus the patented, especially in the 2000s. So I would like to see more progress made in open ecosystem. It's bizarre that so few companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, have such a strong say on what goes on your phone and the business models you're allowed to deploy. I can install pretty much anything I want on Windows or Linux, but then when it goes to Google phones, so Android phones, and it goes to Apple phones, it's curated at the core. Now, that curation has benefits. It has allowed mass market adoption. There are billions of users of smartphones all around the planet. Smartphones are the dominant business model, well beyond anything the PC has achieved. So it seems like that curation is socially acceptable, but it has the consequences of transfer of mass wholesale transfer of power to the few. I would like to see an open phone. There's been a lot of projects that have attempted this. There's been a lot of people trying to create diversity in the phone space. People have ported Ubuntu to the phone. There have been people to try to build varieties like Silent Circle. There are OSs, for example, Copperhead OS, these types of things that exist. And I've kind of followed along, and I know all the guys. We run into each other every few years at different cryptographic or security conferences, and they always try to tell me this is the year that people are going to pay attention and wake up. A Libre phone is an example of that. Even has little hardware switches on it that allows you to like turn off the camera and turn off the microphone and other things with a hardware disconnect, so it can't be hacked into. And unfortunately, that whole industry is just not where it needs to be. So it is what it is, and we wish the best, but that's a problem I can't solve. I'd like to, because Cardano has to run on infrastructure, and if it's running on proprietary or curated infrastructure, actually it means it's a cat and mouse game, where either you allow all the features of Cardano, or whatever gets deployed on that proprietary platform has to be in some way sanitized, as we've seen with MetaMask, for example, and some of the decisions they've made recently. Now, this is an interesting one. What are your thoughts on psilocybin, and do you believe in its ability to reset the brain for the better? So psilocybin is the chemical that causes you to trip when you eat a magic mushroom. And for a long time, people just thought it was some sort of club drug in common culture, like the hippie drug. But it turns out it's been used for thousands of years by shamans and cultures for all kinds of rituals and for healing. And lately, Roland Griffiths and others have been studying it. And there's a great series of experiments at Johns Hopkins that are looking at the application of this substance for the treatment of PTSD, depression, and other maladies of the mind. And it turns out that the clinical evidence is they're more effective than the drugs that people are using. So what it does is it messes with your default mode network. And if you're really curious about this, there's a great book from Michael Pollan called How to Change Your Mind. And if you don't want to read the book, then just Google him and Joe Rogan and listen to the podcast with Michael Pollan. And that podcast really covers what he discovered by researching psychedelics. Now, interestingly enough, some of the things the Neural Meditation Institute and others are looking at is if one was using guided meditation with an EEG, could you enter into the same clearing refresh that the refresh of the default mode network has achieved via psilocybin? And the answer is yes, surprisingly. So you might not actually have to take a psychedelic to achieve the same things a psychedelic achieves. So that's an emerging area of research, and it's quite exciting. Charles, why, if you're a huge proponent of FOSS, do you use an OS like Windows? I do. I use Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, and iPad OS and Android. I use all the operating systems. I'm not one or the other. I do use Linux extensively, especially things like Cubes OS and Ubuntu are two. For high security applications, I use Cubes, and for general purpose stuff, I use Linux. I'm going to start doing a lot of stuff in data science the second part of this year. And I'm probably going to do all the programming of that on Ubuntu. I used to use Linux extensively because I used to do a lot of work with Sage. And Sage has a Python-like syntax, and Sage works best on Linux. And LaTeX also works best on Linux. So all that work involved that. But you develop habits, and there are certain things Windows is just really easy with. But lately, Windows has not really been as compelling as it used to be back in the XP days and so forth. And you can do everything you want on Linux. And I find myself using tablet OSs like Android OS and iOS far more than I'm actually using the desktop stuff outside of the getting stuff done. Charles, big fan, want to start coding, but I don't know where to start. Do you have any suggestions? In terms of languages, I thought a lot about this. Python is probably the best beginner and high utility language. Probably a close second is JavaScript. But Python, I think, is a better pedagogical entry point because there's so many textbooks, so many courses, and there's great stuff on Udemy, great stuff on Code School, great stuff like Learn Python the Hard Way. Thousands of curriculums out there. You'll never be disappointed. There's even a course from MIT on introduction to computer science, and it's taught in Python. And there's just so much free pedagogy there, and you can do everything in it. It's a really good starting point for coding. And then if you want to learn computer science, it's a good entry point to move in that direction. There used to be more debate, but I think it is kind of the universal language to start with. And that's coming from a guy who likes functional programming. Like it used to be like Lisp, structure of interpretation of computer programs. There you go. Sadly, no. JavaScript is a lot better than it used to be too. It was a prototypical inheritance, language, and didn't have classes or anything. And so the object-oriented paradigm was a little wonky. But now JavaScript 6, ECMAScript 6, it has everything. So, yeah, heart's content. Charles, will you use Starlink for your ranch? No. What I did is I blasted out a 1.5 mile road up to a mountaintop. I built a 30-foot microwave tower and trenched out a fiber optic cable from the tower down to the ranch structures. So I get gigabit internet at the ranch. Patrick Moore asks, when will JavaScript developers be able to start working with Plutus? I wouldn't recommend it. What I'd recommend is if you're a JavaScript developer, learn Solidity and then build on Mamba, the Ethereum sidechain. It's a much easier port. Plutus is really for those who want to invest time to write high assurance applications or high performance main chain applications. All right, since I don't get any good questions, do you ever contribute to Sea Boulder? I did make a rather large donation to them, but that's for different time, honoring an old friend of mine. All right, everybody. Had a lot of fun. Enjoyed. From time to time, do AMA. Sorry, I only have an hour, but I have an engagement I have to get to. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day. There's going to be a lot of fun things in the coming months. Going to Consensus, more likely than not. That'll be June 9th to 12th. Mark that on your calendars. I will be there, and likely a large chunk of my team will be, alongside many others, and we'll make an announcement at a later date about the nature of that. Stay tuned for Cardano 360, a lot to say, huge amount of progress on many different things, but there's always more time to tell you later. Talk to you soon. Cheers.